By 1971, nearly every kitchen in America held at least one piece of a company that had never spent a dollar on network television advertising. Millions of women had never seen a Tupperware commercial. They didn't need one. Someone's neighbor had already sold it to them in a living room, over coffee, on a Tuesday afternoon. At its peak, close to 2 million people, almost all of them women, earned a living selling a plastic bowl with a lid that made a soft burping sound when it sealed. Not in stores, in houses, in circles of folding chairs and paper plates, from Ohio to Oregon. 50 years later, the company that built that empire filed for bankruptcy, undone by something as simple as a website it never got around to building. How does a plastic container become the first taste of financial independence for an entire generation of American women, and then vanish because nobody thought to sell it online? Earl Silas Tupper was born in 1907 on a farm in Berlin, New Hampshire, the only child of a family that never had much money to spare. He grew up moving between farms in central Massachusetts, and by the time he was 10 years old, he was already selling produce and poultry door to door, learning early that a good pitch could turn a wagon of vegetables into cash. He was not a natural student. He barely finished high school, but he never stopped filling notebooks with inventions, sketches, and half-formed business ideas, chasing a belief that stayed with him his whole life, that he was destined for wealth and recognition if only he could find the right material to build it with. His first real business, a tree surgery and landscaping company called Tupper Tree Doctors, collapsed in the Great Depression in 1936. He was broke, but not out of ideas. He took a job at DuPont's plastics division in Leominster, Massachusetts, and there for the first time, he got his hands on something that would change everything. Black, foul-smelling polyethylene slag, a waste byproduct left over from oil refining. Most people saw garbage. Tupper saw a future. Working alone in the years after he left DuPont, he spent months purifying that slag, stripping away the odor and the brittleness until he had something no one else had. A flexible, lightweight, nearly unbreakable plastic he called Poly-T. In 1946 in Leominster, he introduced his first real product, the Wonder Bowl, a lightweight container sealed with what he called the Tupper seal, a lid that locked airtight only after you pressed it down and released the trapped air in a soft burping motion. He believed he had solved a problem every American kitchen had lived with for generations. Spoiled food, soggy leftovers, lids that never quite fit. He believed plastic, done right, could be as trustworthy as glass and as elegant as good design. He hated the word plastic itself, associating it with the cheap, brittle, foul-smelling products of the past, and he refused to use it to describe his own creation. There was just one problem. Nobody bought it. He placed the Wonder Bowl in hardware stores and department stores across the country, even opened a showroom on Fifth Avenue in New York. The bowls sat on shelves next to glass and tin, and customers walked right past them. They could not understand the seal without seeing it demonstrated, without someone showing them how to press the lid down and hear that quiet burp that meant the food inside was safe. A product built entirely on a sensory experience was being sold in a place where no one could touch it, test it, or hear it work. What Tupper did not yet know was that two Stanley Home Products saleswomen, working parties in living rooms in Massachusetts and Michigan, had already discovered something he hadn't, that his bowls sold extraordinarily well when a real person held one up, sealed it in front of a room full of skeptical neighbors, and let them hear that sound for themselves. One of those women, a divorced mother from Detroit named Brownie Wise, was about to pick up a telephone and make a call to Tupper's office that would decide the future of the company he thought he already understood. In 1951, Brownie Wise picked up the phone and called Earl Tupper's office in Massachusetts, following up on a complaint about a late shipment. She ended up talking her way into a meeting, and within months, Tupper had made a decision that would reshape his entire company. He pulled Tupperware out of every store in America and staked its future entirely on women selling it in their own living rooms. Wise became the head of Tupperware home parties, and what followed was less a business strategy than a cultural wildfire. The ritual was almost always the same. A woman, a housewife, a mother, sometimes a widow trying to make ends meet, invited her neighbors over for an afternoon. Folding chairs were pulled out, coffee was poured, and then the hostess, or traveling dealer, would hold up a bowl, snap on the lid, press it down, and wait for that soft, unmistakable burp of trapped air escaping through the seal. Women leaned in. They passed the bowls around, turned them over, pressed the lids themselves, listened for the sound that meant it was working. It felt like a magic trick performed with kitchenware, and it worked precisely because it happened in a kitchen, at a table, among people who trusted each other's opinions more than any advertisement. For the women who hosted these parties, something more was happening underneath the sales pitch. This was the early 1950s, an era when a married woman opening her own bank account without her husband's signature was still, in many places, nearly impossible. A Tupperware party gave a housewife a legitimate reason to earn her own money, under her own name, without ever calling it a job in the way her husband had a job. She could host a party on a Tuesday afternoon, sell enough bowls and pitchers to cover the week's groceries, and still be home before her children got back from school. For thousands of women across the country, that quiet transaction, bowls for cash, cash that was hers, was the first taste of financial independence they had ever known. The company grew almost entirely on word of mouth and the loyalty of its sales force. Wise built an entire culture around it. Sales conventions in Florida, where top-performing women were driven onto the stage in convertibles, showered with mink stoles, diamond bracelets, even new cars, all paid for by Tupperware. She called them jubilees, and for a woman who spent most of her week doing unpaid housework, being crowned on a stage in Kissimmee, Florida, in front of thousands of cheering saleswomen was not a small thing. It was recognition most of them had never received anywhere else in their lives. By the middle of the decade, Tupperware parties were not a regional curiosity. They were a national phenomenon, spreading through suburbs from coast to coast as post-war America built new subdivisions and filled them with young families hungry for both community and a little extra income. The company's reach crossed generations almost immediately. A mother who hosted parties in 1955 would, 20 years later, be handing her own daughter a starter set of bowls, teaching her how to press the lid down just right, passing along both the product and the habit in the same afternoon. Tupperware wasn't advertised on television, but it didn't need to be. It traveled from kitchen to kitchen, mouth to mouth, faster than any commercial could have moved it. Brownie Wise herself became something the sales force had never quite seen before. A woman running a national division of a major American company, celebrated in the press as proof that a woman with no formal business training could out-earn most men in the country. In 1954, she became the first woman ever featured on the cover of Business Week, a moment that made her a celebrity far beyond the world of plastic kitchenware. She was, by every visible measure, the public face of Tupperware's success. Earl Tupper, meanwhile, stayed in Massachusetts, running his factories with the same obsessive precision he'd always had, largely out of the spotlight his own invention had created. That arrangement worked for a while. Tupper built the product, Wise built the movement around it. Together, they had created something neither one of them could have built alone. A business that ran on trust, community, and the sound of a lid sealing shut in 100,000 living rooms across the country. But the very thing that made Tupperware so powerful, a public narrative in which one woman got most of the credit, was about to become a problem neither Tupper nor Wise saw coming. What happens when the man who owns the company can no longer stand watching someone else take the blow? In 1958, the tension that had been quietly building between Earl Tupper and Brownie Wise finally broke. For nearly 8 years, Tupper had let her run Tupperware home parties with almost no interference, watching from Massachusetts as she built conventions, crowned sales queens, and turned herself into a national celebrity. But as magazine profiles increasingly credited Wise, not Tupper, with the company's success, and as larger corporations began circling with buyout offers, something in Tupper shifted. He fired her abruptly, stripped her name from the company's official histories, and began quietly steering Tupperware toward a sale. It was the first sign that the empire built on trust between two very different people could not survive the ego of the man who owned it. But even as that personal drama played out at the top, the machine underneath it kept expanding, because the model itself no longer depended on any single person to run it. The genius of the Tupperware party was that it scaled without a single storefront, a single advertisement, or a single corporate salesperson on payroll. Every new dealer recruited more hostesses. Every hostess recruited more guests, some of whom became dealers themselves. It was a living network that grew the way a rumor spreads. One living room at a time, one Tuesday afternoon at a time. And by the late 1950s, that network had already crossed state lines from Massachusetts and Florida into nearly every region of the country. The company built an entire management structure to support this growth. Distributors who oversaw dealers, dealers who oversaw hostesses, each layer earning a commission on the sales of the layer below. It looked on paper almost like a small army, except the soldiers were suburban women, and their only weapon was a bowl with a good seal. For a woman with no other path into the workforce, becoming a distributor meant something close to running her own small business, complete with a car, a territory, and a paycheck that could, in a good month, out-earn her husband's job. For the company, it meant national coverage without ever opening a single retail location. By 1960, Tupperware had taken its home party model across the Atlantic, launching operations in Weybridge, England, and proving the format could travel far beyond the American suburb that had birthed it. The parties looked different in different places. Different snacks on the table, different accents in the room, but the format stayed remarkably consistent. Gather a group of women in someone's home, demonstrate the seal, let the product sell itself through touch and sound, rather than through any pitch a stranger could make. What had started as a Massachusetts sales technique was becoming something closer to a global export, one living room at a time. This kind of growth came with a hidden cost that would not become visible for decades. Because the entire business depended on women having the free time, social networks, and cultural expectation to host parties on weekday afternoons, it was quietly betting its future on a version of American life that would not last forever. As long as most married women stayed home and built their social lives around the neighborhood, the model worked beautifully. Nobody in 1960, watching a room full of women laughing over a burping seal, could have imagined a future where that afternoon simply would not exist anymore, where those same women would be at an office instead of a living room, with no time on a Tuesday to host anyone at all. For now, though, the expansion looked unstoppable. Every year brought new products, new territories, new sales records, and new women stepping onto a stage in Florida to be crowned for outselling everyone else in the region. The company Tupper had built almost by accident, and the movement Wise had built almost entirely on her own instincts. Together, had turned a plastic bowl into one of the most efficient, most human distribution networks in American business. What none of them yet understood was that a machine built entirely on people, rather than storefronts or advertising, would only ever be as strong as the loyalty of the people running it, and that loyalty was about to be tested by forces far bigger than a boardroom feud in Massachusetts. By the 1960s and into the 1970s, Tupperware had stopped being just a product people bought and become something closer to a fixture of American domestic life, as ordinary and expected in a suburban kitchen as a refrigerator or a coffee pot. It was not unusual for a single household to own dozens of pieces collected over years, stacked in cabinets, passed down, added to at nearly every party a woman attended. The brand had achieved something almost no consumer product manages. It had stopped being advertised and started being assumed, a background detail of American life rather than a name anyone needed to be sold on anymore. The company's own convention culture captured just how far it had traveled from a single bowl sold out of a Massachusetts showroom. Each year, top-selling women were flown to Kissimmee, Florida for the Tupperware Jubilee, an event that looked less like a corporate sales meeting and more like a coronation. Winners were paraded onto a stage in convertibles, dressed in gowns, crowned with tiaras, and handed prizes that ranged from first stoles to diamond jewelry to brand new cars, all funded by a company whose entire product line cost a few dollars apiece. For women who spent most of their week doing invisible, unpaid labor at home, that stage was one of the only places in their lives where thousands of people stood and applauded specifically for them. Inside the homes where the parties happened, the experience carried its own quiet ritual. A hostess would clear the dining table, set out coffee and a plate of cookies, and wait for the neighborhood women to arrive on a weekday afternoon while husbands were still at work and children were still at school. The dealer would open her case, lift out a bowl, snap the lid into place, and press down until that unmistakable burp confirmed the seal had caught. Women took turns holding the bowls, checking the fit, asking questions about the guarantee, comparing notes on which pieces they already owned. It was equal parts shopping trip and social gathering, and for many of the women in that room, it was the only adult conversation they'd have all day that didn't revolve around their children. The brand's reach crossed generations, almost without anyone noticing it happening. A woman who attended her first Tupperware party as a young bride in the early 1950s might, 20 years later, be hosting her own daughter's bridal shower using the very same catalog, teaching her the same trick of pressing the lid down at just the right angle. Grandmothers passed sets down to mothers, who passed them down to daughters starting their own households, so that a single brand name came to sit quietly inside the memory of three generations of the same family, tied not to a store or an advertisement, but to a specific afternoon, a specific kitchen, a specific woman who taught them how to use it. Tupperware's cultural footprint extended well beyond the living room. By the mid-1950s, Brownie Wise had become a genuine celebrity in her own right, profiled in national magazines as living proof that a woman with no formal business background could out-earn most men in the country. In 1954, she appeared on the cover of Business Week, the first woman ever given that distinction, a moment that turned Tupperware's sales strategy into a story about what American women were capable of when given the right opportunity. For a brief, remarkable stretch, a plastic bowl, and the woman who sold it became a symbol of something much larger than either one. None of this happened by accident, and none of it happened quickly. It took nearly 2 decades of steady, patient growth. One living room, one hostess, one jubilee at a time, for Tupperware to become less a company and more a shared American experience, one that belonged equally to the woman hosting the party and the woman attending it. This was the peak, the moment worth pausing on, because everything that came afterward would be measured against exactly how much was lost. And somewhere underneath all that celebration, in boardrooms and living rooms alike, the first quiet cracks were already beginning to show, waiting for someone to notice them before it was too late. In 1958, the quiet tension between Earl Tupper and Brownie Wise finally reached its breaking point, and the way it ended would say something uncomfortable about how the company actually worked underneath all that celebration. For nearly a decade, Wise had been the public face of Tupperware, the woman journalist credited with turning a slow-selling plastic bowl into a national sensation. Tupper, watching from Massachusetts, had let her run the sales division almost entirely on her own terms. But as her fame grew and reporters increasingly framed the company's success as her creation rather than his, something shifted in him. He had also by then been approached by larger corporations eager to buy Tupperware outright, and his accountants were warning him that if he died as sole owner, his children would face a punishing tax bill. He refused to give up control by forming a board. Instead, he chose the simpler option. He fired Wise abruptly and without warning, then went further, quietly removing her name from the company's official written history as if the decades she had spent building the sales force had never happened. Later that same year, Tupper sold Tupperware to the Rexall Drug Company for $16 million, divorced his wife, renounced his American citizenship, and moved permanently to Costa Rica. The man who had spent 20 years obsessing over the exact tension of a plastic seal simply walked away from the company that bore his name, leaving behind a sales force of hundreds of thousands of women who had built their livelihoods, their friendships, and in some cases their entire identities around a business he no longer wanted any part of. For the women hosting parties in their living rooms that year, almost none of this internal drama was visible. They kept selling bowls. They kept hosting Tuesday afternoons. The company kept growing. Whatever had broken at the top had not yet reached the people actually running the machine. That was the first kind of crack. Sudden, personal, resolved quietly behind closed doors before most customers ever heard about it. The second kind of crack was slower and far more dangerous, because nobody inside the company was positioned to see it coming at all. Tupperware's entire business model rested on one quiet assumption, that American women would keep having free weekday afternoons to host parties and free weekday afternoons to attend them. Through the 1950s and 1960s, that assumption held. But by the 1970s, something in American households had begun shifting in a way that had nothing to do with plastic, seals, or sales conventions. More married women were taking full-time jobs outside the home. The number of women in the American workforce climbed steadily through the decade, and the ones who might once have spent a Tuesday afternoon at a neighbor's dining table hearing a pitch for storage bowls were now spending that same Tuesday afternoon at an office. Nobody at Tupperware headquarters in Florida was ringing alarm bells about this in 1975. Sales were still strong. The Jubilees were still packed. A dealer working a territory in Ohio or Georgia had no reason to think her livelihood was in any danger. The parties she hosted were as full as they'd ever been, the orders just as steady. That was the particular cruelty of this kind of crack. It did not announce itself with a bad quarter or a public scandal. It moved slowly, one working woman at a time, one afternoon that used to be free now filled with a job instead, until an entire generation later, the pool of available hostesses and available guests had quietly shrunk in ways nobody at the company had bothered to measure. The company's response, when it eventually came, was not to question the model itself, but to lean harder into what had always worked. Recruit more dealers, promise bigger rewards, push further into new international markets where the same social conditions that had built the American business in the 1950s were only just beginning. It worked for a while, the way patching a leaking roof works for a while. Tupperware expanded into new countries through the 1980s and 1990s, finding fresh waves of women in Latin America, Europe, and eventually Asia who could fill the role American women were slowly stepping away from. It was a real solution and a real success for years, but it was also quietly a company solving a demographic problem in America by exporting the same problem to new countries, one market at a time, rather than asking the harder question sitting underneath all of it. If the entire business was built on women having free afternoons for parties, what happens to a company like this once women everywhere eventually stop having those afternoons to spare? And if nobody at headquarters was asking that question while the parties were still full, who exactly was supposed to notice the crack before it reached the foundation? For years, the danger sitting inside Tupperware's business model had a simple name that almost nobody at the company wanted to say out loud: the internet. As online shopping reshaped how Americans bought everything from groceries to furniture through the late 1990s and 2000s, Tupperware's leadership kept making the same quiet bet, year after year, that its future still belonged to a living room and a hostess rather than a web page and a shopping cart. The company did not lack the money or the technology to build a real e-commerce operation. It lacked the willingness to admit that the model built by Brownie Wise 70 years earlier might no longer be enough on its own. Executives worried reasonably at first that a website selling Tupperware directly to customers would gut the very distributors and dealers whose loyalty had built the company. But reasonable caution, repeated for 2 decades without ever being revisited, hardened into something closer to paralysis. Tupperware did not launch a real online store until February of 2021. It did not sell through Amazon until June of 2022. It did not appear on Target's website until October of that same year. By the time leadership finally opened those doors, an entire generation of shoppers had already learned to buy their kitchenware with a few taps on a phone, from brands that had been building that habit with them for 15 years. While the digital world moved on without it, the company's finances were quietly eroding in ways that would not become visible to the public until it was far too late to fix quietly. Debt piled up year after year, eventually climbing past $700 million, a staggering weight for a company whose signature products still sold for a few dollars apiece. Regulators found that Tupperware had failed to maintain accurate books and records, and the company was hit with a steep federal fine, a finding that suggested the problems went beyond slow strategy into something closer to a breakdown in basic financial discipline. Inside the company's Florida headquarters, the people making these choices were, by most accounts, not reckless or cartoonish villains. They were executives protecting a business model they genuinely believed in, reluctant to be the ones who dismantled the very system that had made Tupperware a household name in the first place. But belief was not enough to hold back a debt load that size or a market that had already moved on without asking permission. Out on the front lines, far from the boardroom, the consequences arrived in far more personal terms. In 2024, Tupperware closed its only remaining American factory in Hemingway, South Carolina, laying off 148 workers and shifting production to a plant in Mexico. For those employees, many of whom had spent years or decades on that production line, the closure was not an abstract business decision about supply chains and cost structures. It was the end of a paycheck, a routine, and in many cases, a piece of local identity, since the factory had been a fixture of the town's economy for years. The same slow erosion was happening on the sales side of the business too, as longtime distributors and dealers, many of whom had built their entire livelihood around recruiting new hostesses, watched younger women show far less interest in either attending a party or joining the sales force themselves. The network that had once expanded itself effortlessly, one living room at a time, was aging along with the women who had built it, and there was no comparable generation stepping in behind them. The moment insiders finally admitted in public that the company might not survive came in November of 2022, when Tupperware disclosed that it could no longer guarantee compliance with its credit agreements and warned investors directly that there was substantial doubt about its ability to continue as a going concern. It was one thing for employees on a factory floor or dealers in the field to sense that something felt off. It was another thing entirely for the company itself, in a formal filing, to say the words out loud. From that point forward, the story became a race against the clock. A new CEO, Lori-Ann Goldman, arriving in October of 2023 with real turnaround experience from Spanx and Avon, brought in specifically to save a business that was already deep in the kind of trouble no single executive could fix in a matter of months. She inherited a company with the wrong debt, the wrong infrastructure, and roughly 2 decades of deferred decisions about the internet, all landing on her desk at once. By the time all of this became public, the pattern was impossible to miss for anyone looking closely. A company built entirely on human trust and word of mouth had spent 20 years avoiding the one investment that might have kept that trust relevant in a new era, while its debt quietly grew large enough to make even a successful turnaround feel almost impossible. The dealers in the field had done nothing wrong. The factory workers in South Carolina had done nothing wrong. The women hosting parties in their living rooms had done nothing wrong. The decisions that mattered had all been made somewhere else, by people who kept believing, a little too long, that the model which built the company would be enough to save it too. And now the question was no longer whether trouble was coming. The question was simply how the public would watch it arrive, and who would still be standing in that living room when the lights finally went out. The first unmistakable sign that Tupperware might not survive reached the public in April of 2023, when the company warned investors outright that its ability to continue as a going concern was in serious doubt. Language that in corporate filings functions almost like a public confession. Wall Street reacted the way it often does to companies teetering on the edge, with wild, unpredictable swings that had less to do with the business itself and more to do with speculation about who might rescue it. In the months that followed, Tupperware stock actually surged, at one point climbing more than 700% from its lows, as retail investors piled in on rumors of a turnaround or a buyout, chasing a story that felt more like a meme than a recovery. Underneath that noise, the fundamentals never actually improved. Sales kept sliding. The debt kept growing. The surge in the stock price was a symptom of speculation, not evidence that anything underlying had actually been fixed. Through 2023 and into 2024, the company kept trying to buy itself time. It brought in Lori-Ann Goldman as chief executive in October of 2023, betting that her experience turning around Spanx and Avon might translate into a similar rescue here. It closed its last American factory in South Carolina, moving production to Mexico in an effort to cut costs. It negotiated repeatedly with lenders, restructuring its debt obligations and hiring the investment bank Moelis & Company to explore what the filings euphemistically called strategic alternatives. None of it was enough. The debt load, which had ballooned past $700 million, kept outpacing every effort to shrink it, and the missed regulatory disclosures and delayed financial filings only deepened the sense among investors and creditors alike that the company was running out of options faster than it could find new ones. For employees, the unraveling did not arrive as a single dramatic headline, but as a series of smaller losses that added up over roughly 18 months. There was the day the South Carolina factory workers learned their jobs were moving to Mexico. There was the day corporate staff learned of yet another round of leadership changes, another executive brought in to fix what the last one hadn't been able to. For dealers and distributors in the field, the anxiety built more quietly through conversations with regional managers who had fewer answers each time the headquarters called, through hostesses who noticed their catalog updates felt thinner, their bonus incentives less generous than the year before. Nobody in the sales force woke up one morning to find the doors locked. Instead, they spent the better part of 2 years watching a company they had built their livelihoods around visibly struggling to explain what its own future looked like. For customers, the collapse was almost invisible until the very end, which was, in its own way, the strangest part of the whole story. Tupperware products remained on shelves and in catalogs through most of this period. A woman buying a set of storage containers for her daughter's first apartment in the summer of 2024 had no particular reason to think the brand was circling bankruptcy. The packaging looked the same, the products worked the same, the seal still made the same familiar sound. That quiet normalcy made the eventual announcement land even harder for longtime customers, many of whom had grown up with the brand in their own family kitchens and had simply assumed, the way people assume about institutions that have always been there, that Tupperware would simply always exist in some form. Then, on September 17, 2024, in Orlando, Florida, the same city that had once hosted the company's glittering Jubilee conventions, Tupperware Brands Corporation filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection in federal court in Delaware. In its filing, the company listed between $500 million and $1 billion in assets against between $1 billion and $10 billion in liabilities, with somewhere between 50 and 100,000 creditors owed money. Chief Executive Officer Lori Goldman released a statement calling it the best choice possible in an extraordinarily difficult situation, framing the filing not as a surrender, but as a chance to restructure and continue operating. The company insisted it would keep selling products through its sales consultants, its retail partners, and its website, the very website it had waited until 2021 to build in the first place. Media coverage of the filing carried an unmistakable note of public mourning, even among outlets that rarely wrote about corporate bankruptcies with any sentimentality at all. Reporters repeatedly returned to the same image, a brand that had once symbolized independence and community for American women, undone not by a single scandal or a single bad decision, but by 2 decades of quiet failure to keep up with how people actually shopped. Industry analysts pointed bluntly at the company's absence from e-commerce as the single clearest explanation for what had happened. One retail consultant telling reporters that the company had been, in her words, absurdly late to the online shopping world it should have entered a decade earlier. The stock, which had traded above $90 a share at its peak a decade earlier, had by that point fallen to less than 50 cents. The final chapter of the corporate story moved quickly after the filing, in the clinical, procedural language of bankruptcy court, rather than the warm language of living rooms and Jubilee conventions. 2 months later, in November of 2024, a group formed by the company's own secured lenders completed a purchase of the Tupperware brand name and its operations across its core markets through an entity created specifically for that purpose called Party Products, LLC. The name itself, chosen by lawyers and lenders rather than by anyone who had ever hosted a party in their own living room, captured just how far the company had traveled from its origins. What had once been a movement built on trust between neighbors was now, at the end, a set of assets being reassigned on a legal document by the very banks that had extended the credit the company could no longer repay. There was no single dramatic final day, the way there might be for a retail chain with a flagship store to padlock. No crowd gathered outside a closing location, the way there might be for a beloved diner serving its last plate. The end of Tupperware Brands Corporation as an independent public company arrived instead through paperwork filed in a Delaware courthouse. and a press release issued from Orlando. A quiet administrative death for a company that had built its entire identity on noise, community, and the sound of thousands of women pressing down on a lid at the exact same moment, decade after decade, all across the country. The brand itself would survive technically under new ownership and a sharply reduced footprint. But the company that Earl Tupper had built from refinery waste and that Brownie Wise had turned into a movement effectively ended that September, not with the sound of a burping seal, but with the sound of nothing at all. In the aftermath of the bankruptcy, the company that emerged looked almost unrecognizable next to the one Brownie Wise had built decades earlier. Under Party Products LLC, Tupperware continued operating in nearly 70 countries, but as a much smaller, more cautious business, no longer chasing the kind of explosive growth that had once filled convention centers in Florida with cheering saleswomen. The brand survived technically, but the version of it that survived bore little resemblance to the cultural force it had once been. It had become, in the language of the industry, a legacy name being managed for whatever value remained, rather than a company charting new territory the way it once had. What replaced Tupperware in American kitchens had already been replacing it for years before the bankruptcy ever became official. Amazon and big box retailers now offered nearly identical storage containers at a fraction of the price, shipped to a doorstep within a day or two, no living room party required. A newer generation of brands built specifically around sustainability, offering glass and silicone alternatives marketed as healthier and more environmentally responsible than plastic, captured exactly the kind of younger, environmentally conscious customer that Tupperware had never quite figured out how to reach. The irony was hard to miss. The company that had once made plastic feel modern, clean, and aspirational in the 1950s was, by the 2020s, competing against products that succeeded specifically by promising to be less like plastic altogether. There were attempts at revival, though none captured anything close to the original magic. Reality television appearances, social media campaigns aimed at younger buyers, occasional nostalgic marketing pushes, referencing the brand's mid-century heyday, all of it generated brief spikes of attention without ever rebuilding the underlying sales structure that had once made the company powerful. The pandemic years had briefly offered a glimpse of what a genuine comeback might have looked like as homebound Americans rediscovered cooking and food storage in 2020 and 2021, and Tupperware's sales ticked upward for the first time in years. But the company treated that bump as validation of its existing model rather than as a final window to fundamentally rebuild its digital presence. And by the time that pandemic-era interest faded, the underlying problems were still exactly where they had been before. The broader lesson sitting underneath Tupperware's collapse extended well beyond one company's failure to build a website on time. It was a story about what happens when a business model built entirely on human relationships and word of mouth meets a generation of customers who no longer organize their lives or their afternoons around neighborhood gatherings and door-to-door trust. The same shift that hollowed out Tupperware's hostess network, women working full-time, socializing through screens rather than living rooms, buying on impulse from their phones rather than planning around a scheduled party, reshaped an entire category of direct sales companies built on the same mid-century assumptions. Tupperware was simply the largest, most visible casualty of an economic and cultural shift that had been building quietly for 50 years, long before anyone at the company was willing to say the word obsolete out loud. The economic toll of the collapse extended far beyond the corporate offices in Orlando. The 148 factory workers laid off in Hemingway, South Carolina, lost jobs that had anchored a small town's economy for years, with no comparable employer waiting to absorb them. Tens of thousands of dealers and distributors around the world, many of whom had spent decades building their own small businesses inside the Tupperware system, watched their income and their professional identity dissolve alongside the parent company's stock price. For some of the longest-serving hostesses, women who had built friendships, reputations, and entire social calendars around their role in the Tupperware network, the loss went beyond a paycheck. It meant the quiet disappearance of a role that had once given their lives a specific kind of structure and purpose, one that no online storefront, however convenient, could ever replicate for them. What in the end does it mean to lose something like this? Not a store on a street corner that can be pointed to and mourned, but an entire social ritual that simply stopped happening, one living room at a time, until there were no more living rooms left doing it at all. Picture a dining room table on a Tuesday afternoon, sometime in the early 1970s, the good tablecloth pulled out for company, a coffee pot and still warm on the counter. A dozen women sit in folding chairs pulled in from the garage, paper plates balanced on their knees, half listening, half gossiping, waiting for the part of the afternoon they actually came for. A hostess lifts a bowl from an open case, fits the lid into place, presses down with the flat of her palm, and the room goes quiet for just a second, waiting for that soft, particular sound of air escaping through a perfect seal. Someone laughs. Someone reaches for the bowl to try it herself. Outside, the school bus hasn't come yet, the husbands aren't home yet, and for 1 hour in the middle of an ordinary week, this room belongs entirely to the women sitting in it. That hour was never really about the bowl. It was about what the bowl gave permission for. In an era when a married woman needed her husband's signature to open a bank account, a Tupperware party gave her a reason nobody could argue with to leave the house, gather with other women, and walk away with cash that was hers alone to spend. It gave her a title, however small, hostess, dealer, distributor, at a time when the only title most of the world offered her was wife or mother. It gave her a stage in Florida once a year, a convertible to ride in, a crown to wear, applause from thousands of women who understood exactly what she built because they were building the same thing themselves. For a company selling plastic containers, Tupperware spent 70 years quietly in the business of something far more valuable, giving ordinary women a small, defensible claim to a life that was partly their own. That is why this story was never really about the products going out of style, the way people eventually stopped wanting shoulder pads or rotary phones. Tupperware didn't die because women stopped needing airtight storage for their leftovers. It ended because the specific afternoon that made the whole system work. Women home together on a weekday, building friendships across the same folding chairs, week after week, year after year, quietly stopped existing in the way it once had. The company outlived the world it was built for by several decades, coasting on loyalty and habit long after the conditions that created it had already begun to disappear. And by the time its leadership finally reached for a website and an app, an entire generation had already learned to find community somewhere else and to buy their bowls somewhere else too. There is no factory to visit anymore in Hemingway, South Carolina. There is no annual jubilee filling a convention hall in Kissimmee with women in gowns waiting to hear their names called. The brand itself survives in some reduced form under new owners, on shelves next to competitors that would not exist without the path Tupperware first cleared. But the version of it that mattered, the version that gave a housewife in 1955 her first taste of earning her own money, that gave a grandmother in 1975 a set of bowls to pass down to a granddaughter she hadn't met yet, that version is already gone, and no relaunch or nostalgia campaign will bring it back. What deserves to be remembered is not the bankruptcy filing or the stock price falling from $90 to 50 cents. What deserves to be remembered is Earl Tupper, alone in a workshop, turning refinery waste into something useful. It is Brownie Wise on the cover of a business magazine no woman had ever appeared on before her. It is every woman who ever cleared her dining room table on a Tuesday afternoon and, for 1 hour, was something more than someone's wife. Some companies are just businesses. That one, for a while, was a promise kept to an entire generation of women who had never been offered very many promises at all.